Well, hey, good morning, everybody. All right, see you guys. All right, well, good morning, everybody. We just had to have an Auburn guy come up here and help fix the computer, so maybe one of those kind of days, but real quick, my name is Matt Greer. I'm food and agribusiness industry manager at Truist. And I've been with the bank about 22 years, and I graduated back in UGA when it was a heck of a lot easier to get into than it is now. And but you can see the kind of the topics I'm going to cover, and I'll run through these pretty quick. And I'm really just going to focus on the cattle market today because that's some exciting dynamics at play here. And so, just a couple disclaimers: I am not an economist. I'm actually probably a little inbred too. So you just need to take what I say and probably do the opposite. And I stole most of the slides here from smarter people than me. And then we've got Dennis. He'll follow me up. He's from Auburn, and he'll clean up anything I say that's wrong. So. Obviously the pandemic, pent up demand, those sort of things, eating from home, labor, supply chain issues, they all had a lot to do with consumption and price volatility in 20 and 21. And I'm not going to focus that much on that. I think we all understand it pretty well. What I am going to start with is a drought because it's been a driving force for what's been happening the last 12 to really 24 months. And you can see the situation we're now in on the try to use this pointer here, this chart on the left. What it shows you, this is the worst drought since the origin of the U.S. drought monitor in 2000. And in 21, it was a lot worse in the northern plains, not so much in the southern plains. That didn't really happen until 22, but the drought moved around as droughts tend to do. And the cumulative effects are pretty noticeable. And some believe this could be the worst drought out west in nearly 1,000 years. And similar situation was happening in Europe. You know, we heard our Mississippi River was running dry. It was possibly worse over there as the Rhine and Danube. They were at record low levels, not seen in over 500 years. And they keep data back to the Romans. And so those Viking cruise ships couldn't go up and down the river. It was a problem over there as well. So, but this led to some really terrible pasture and rain conditions throughout the West and Southwest. And as the last data I had, and this is October data, 43% of U.S. pasture and range was in record conditions, like record poor conditions. And the second worst year on record was 21, year before that. So the southern plains of Texas and Oklahoma, a lot of cattle out there were impacted the most. At one point, it peaked at 75% of their pasture land was very poor. So Georgia pasture land was okay. But, you know, again, as you go out west, as you see, it gets much worse. And this also meant, and this is the big one, that U.S. hay stocks were down as well. And so hay stocks were at a 10-year low in 21, but we expect the latest hay report comes out that will most likely be at the lowest level since the 1970s. So something less than 140 million tons of hay stock. So we are where we are on hay stocks. I mean, we'll just have to, need to get through April, May before we consider new growth. And obviously, if many of y'all been using supplemental feed, you know how expensive corn is. U.S. cattle inventory forecast. I'm going to talk about cattle on feed. That's the cattle that's out on the feedlots being fed rations before they get ready to slaughter. So recap here on what happened is, so conditions worsened out west, pastureland dried up, water resources became an issue, and the ranchers don't like to do supplemental feed. They started sending cattle to the feedlots, and we ended up with a lot of cattle on feed. Some of this started in 21, carried into 22. And so what you see here on the left are historically high. These are historically high numbers of cattle on feed. We had about 12 million cattle on feed at the beginning of 22. It dropped down, and now we're sitting here in 23 at about, I guess, about 11.7. The chart on the right will show you that total cattle numbers peaked in 19, and that should have at some point meant less cattle on feed. The cattle on feed stayed higher longer than most people. Well, I think most people, at least longer than I thought. And because of the drought of 21 and last year, we have really maintained a higher number of cattle on feedlots simply because we didn't have any in place for them. And so calves in general and heifers specifically, we've had more of those cattle in feedlots. Placements are finally starting to drop, which is the first sign of weakness in the cattle herd. And moving back to the right, if you look at cattle inventory, and this is a projection, and we expect the herd to be down here, down to about under 88 million. So I think it's like 87.7 million specifically. So, and that's the first time since 1952, it's been that low. And so we're going to be around 13.5% net cow culling for 22. And even when you go back to the drought of 2012, 11 and 12 was a big drought as well. It didn't get that high. And so it'll be new records in terms of net cattle culling. So usually we average around 9% cow culling, and typically the cattle cycle helps. It just happens without the help of drought, but the last two cattle cycles have really been exacerbated because of drought. And so, what the cattle cycle is, that's the alternative expansion and contraction of cattle. Really, it's response to changes in profitability by consumers. And so I want to point out too that we'll talk about consumption later, but really in the 60s and really through the late 80s, cattle numbers were well north of 110 million head in the U.S. And that's because we used to eat a lot more beef than chicken. All right, female beef cattle slaughter. So we know we have a lot of cattle on feed. We know the herd numbers are going to be down. Let's talk about kind of the future and rebuilding the herd and what's going to impact that. So if you look at the top right chart, that's heifers on feed. And what we have here is a record percentage of the feedlot inventory is heifers. And it's proof that we are having to do things because of the drought that we normally wouldn't do. The chart on the left also points out that year over year change in female beef cow inventory will be at a record low. And the chart on the bottom right demonstrates that what we were saying about female slaughters percentage of cattle slaughter, it's been rising greatly since 2021. Is projected to be north of 52% for 2022. And not since 1984 have we slaughtered a higher percentage of female cows. And this does create some problems rebuilding the herd. We saw this in 2014. Every heifer that was available to be bred was bred, and we're going to have to do that again. So every healthy heifer in 23 will be bred, and it's supposedly the year of the rabbit in 23. I think it's going to be the year of the bull, but again, cattle slaughter should start to get. I'm glad y'all got it. It's kind of, some of my jokes are like hand grenades. I throw them out there in a few minutes, they go off. But so again, cattle slaughter should start to go down. We've had record beef production to face declining inventory. And that's about to change. There'll be less beef consumption going forward. So beef consumption matters supply. Does that mean beef demand is getting worse? No, the answer is no. We're just not going to produce as much beef, and we can't eat it if we don't produce it. Moving on to cattle prices. Again, talk about a 13.5% net cattle culling on the beef herd. The events we are seeing here are somewhat similar to those in 2011 and 12. And the chart on the left speaks to this. It took a while for that to work through the system, and you saw cattle prices peak in 14 and 15, and we can see cattle prices starting to build again. In the top right, we're seeing live cattle prices. Those sold to packer, they're starting to climb. And the same can be said for feeder cattle, and that's the chart on the bottom right. The dotted line is that's your 5-year average right there. And so, and that runs around 150. It's kind of where it's been. In 22, you can see how those have continued to build to close to, close to 180 we're seeing now. And if you look at the futures market, August 23 feeder cattle, it's like 205, and it only goes up for there. And so that's, that's roughly $25 built into the feeder cattle prices. That doesn't include any basis, but you can see those are rising. Kind of moving on closer to consumer. Chart on the left is U.S. per capita meat consumption. Pork has stayed fairly steady, 50 pounds a person. Chicken consumption really in the early 90s, and going back before that was actually lower than beef consumption. But health warnings around the dangers of eating too much red meat played a role in beef decline. But really, the main reason for chicken's rise is it got a lot cheaper. And that's, you can credit the Purdue and Tysons of the world who really perfected and industrialized the poultry business, which led to a decrease in the price for consumer and increased consumption. Also, we can blame Chick-fil-A is what I do. So back to beef consumption. I said it earlier and repeat, we've been consuming a lot of beef at the expense of our inventory, and that's about to change. And so we're just not going to produce as much beef, and we can't eat if we don't produce it. So chart on the right shows box beef prices. These are in 100-pound weight. Blue line is your 5-year average. In 21, we saw a couple, big spikes. It's pent-up demand. Everyone taking pictures of a tomahawk steak while out on getting their stimulus money. But, that's, it still stayed high compared to the 5-year average. But beef prices peaked in 21 at nearly $350. And for 22, beef prices have held pretty steady around 270, which is really a pretty good sign when you think about what's going on with inflation and gas prices and all the consumers having to cover. But other protein prices have helped that as well. But beef has to be a relative good value, and especially when you compare it to like chicken. So chicken has gone up, and beef has looked like a good value as well. So we keep looking for indications that beef demand is pulling back, and we're seeing a little bit. You look for people going to the cheaper cuts, but it's been so far been pretty minor. It doesn't mean it won't happen. As a matter of fact, I believe it'll happen. I'm just not seeing it at a high level yet. So beef packer profit margins. This will usually get ranchers pretty worked up. These are the margins for packers per head, and some people, these profits look pretty offensive. It's not all the case here. It's kind of this perfect confluence of you had this huge demand outstripping the packers' capacity, and we had a lot of cattle on feed. So let's talk pre-COVID. The 5-year average for a margin for a packer, 2015 to 2019 is it's about $251 per 1,000 pounds. For 2020, that average doubled to $511. That's their profit. And for 21, it went all the way to $684. And for the first few months of 22, it was looking pretty good. It was right around $450, and then it just tanked. And so we went from nearly the peak, $1,000 per head profit in 21 to $137 per head profit in 22. And so these margins are compressing, lots of reasons, but feeder cattle prices are increasing, supplies are tightening, cost of gain is increasing as well. And so the tables are kind of turning somewhat. And if a few things fall the ranchers' way, I think it'll be a good couple of years for ranchers. Speaking of feeding, moving on to feedlots. This is where cattle are finished out being sold to packer. And this chart's for Kansas. I was trying to find some charts and I couldn't. This is kind of the best one I could find, but it kind of illustrates what I wanted to say. So this is cost of gain for feedlots, which has been a real challenge as of late. This really tied to corn prices. So we started 21, called $82, $83 steers. It moved up to about 110 by year in 21. For 22, cost of gain has spiked to 135 for steers, 145 for heifers. And this chart goes all the way back to 2012. So you can see we're at a record cost of gain. It's really challenging for feedlots. And there's not a lot of margin here. So it's going to stay very tight for feedlots for a while, and I don't see any relief anytime soon. U.S. protein production forecast. I'm really just going to focus on the chart on the right, and the chart on the right shows the beef production forecast for 23 compared to previous years. The red column is beef production from 2016 to 2020. Story here is we just had really robust production for 21 and 22, and they were wide open. But at some point, production has to drop, and you can see, I think it's pretty optimistic, but they're already forecasting a drop in production. It could be more of a drop than what is projected here. I don't think it'll be less. So that means beef prices will go higher, and there's less beef. There will be higher beef prices going forward, and price eventually it has to rise so we don't run out. And so the market's job is eventually to figure out who wants it most. And so we are set up for something similar we saw in 2014 and 15. Moving on to beef trade. As for exports, story here is China, East Asia. East Asia's top regional market destination for U.S. beef exports. So during the first 3 quarters of 22, U.S. beef exports to East Asia, including South Korea, Japan, China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, were record 6.6 billion, exceeding last year's exports of 5.4 billion. So that's a 22% increase in value. If you just look at it on a volume basis, it's a 6.4% increase. Moving on to China, U.S. beef exports to China and Hong Kong surpassed 2 billion for the first time in 21. Exports in 22 have already reached 2 billion by September 30th, and that's a 34% increase. And if you look at it just on a volume standpoint, it's a 23% increase. So what's driving this? And it's the growing popularity of beef in China. And we are finally starting to get to participate in that. We haven't gotten to participate in that in the past. And so as their middle class has grown, so has their taste for beef. And they still don't consume anywhere the amount that we do. China probably averages about 11 pounds of meat consumption per person. We're somewhere around, and that's a year. In the U.S., we're around 58 pounds a year per consumption per person. But there's a rule: anything times 1.4 billion is a lot. So I think U.S. beef is going to stay pretty steady on the export side. And now I'm going to do something really stupid, and I'm going to try to predict the weather. So we think about the cattle market, ranch conditions improving, really just kind of for all ag markets. We've got to break this drought and brought on by this lingering La Nina cycle. And on the left was the drought at the end of August of 22, and on the right is the current drought map. And you can see we've had some relief, some moderate drought has emerged though on the East Coast, but things are improving a little bit, but it's really not enough yet. So soil moisture is really low still in the Central Plains and out west, and even though we've had some rain to help offset that, it hasn't been enough. The good news is Corn Belt's got some improvement. And these two slides show long range forecasts. I mean, long range, it goes through March of 23, and there are models right now that are showing La Nina cycle is breaking around kind of March and April of this year. Let's hope they're right. The model on the left is precipitation outlook. West is still looking at a struggle. Our region of the state as well. Corn Belt's fairly positive rain outlook. That's really good news. We need a couple of years of good crops to rebuild supplies. And then the slide on the right is your seasonal temperature outlook. And for the South, we should be, and we've been feeling it, except for in this room where it's about 40 degrees. It's been kind of above normal temperature. So let's hope that La Nina cycle breaks. And then real quick, I'll end with currency. The slide on the left shows currency of our major trade partners. And top left's the euro, top right's the pound, bottom left's the yen, the Japanese, bottom right's the won. And when the dollar is strong, which it has been, that makes, buying our products a little more difficult. They're just more expensive. But I mean, who would have thought a few years ago that the pound and the US dollar would almost be on par? And so the chart on this top right here is forecasting, that's forecasting what's going to happen to the currencies against the dollar in the future. And so the dollar will weaken. And as a general rule, that should be positive for ag export. So just to wrap it up, we need rain. Cattle numbers are really low. Packers, which made a lot of money in the past, they're not going to make a lot of money for the next couple of years. It's going to be real tough for meat packers. And if we can improve pasture land for the ranchers, you should have a good couple of years of growing cattle. So that's all I got. Thank y'all for having me. We do questions. You want to do that? Any questions? You want Dennis?
Right. Appreciate y'all having me. My name is Dennis Brothers from Auburn University, extension professor at the econ department there. Talk to you about poultry profitability outlook. Now, if that's all you knew, how many would be positive about that? Quick survey of the audience. Who here are poultry growers? Any poultry growers in the audience? They're all home picking up chickens. How about poultry lenders? Got some lenders, other allied industries, suppliers, those kind of people like that. I've got one of those back there. As we talk about poultry profitability, there's two distinct ways of talking about it. I've been talking about it from the integrator standpoint, and we're talking about it from the grower standpoint. I tend to focus on the growers, but what do growers have to focus on? They respond to what the integrators do. So what happens to the industry and the market, and then as the integrators respond to that, that affects growers ultimately. What's so saying, what is it rolls downhill? It definitely does roll downhill. So what's happening in the poultry industry? Now, I did this outlook for Alabama, and the colors on the left were orange and blue then, so y'all can thank me for that. It's a little nod to the dogs. I guess I probably can't get a war eagle this morning, I guess, can I? Okay. If you look at the industry as a whole in the nation, poultry is a growing industry. Now, these numbers are partial. Those numbers did hit pretty close to 51 by the end of the year. But if you look at Georgia, not quite the same graph in Georgia. The Georgia overall production was down a little bit. Bird size makes a difference there. Georgia birds are closer to the national average. National average is about 650. Georgia is about 610. And that's been the same for the last couple of years. But I foresee the industry in general continuing its slow increase every year over year, because there's a lot of reasons for that. If you look at the supply and demand pressures on chicken, inflation in general, as we know, why is that? As you have less money to spend, you still want to buy protein. Poultry is still the cheapest protein out there, and that's puts a positive pressure on poultry market. Beef and pork prices, we know, have been very high the last year in comparison. That alternative, folks buy chicken. There's been some surveys out here lately that look at what the younger generation prefer. And most of them, if you like my kids grew up on chicken fingers. That's about all they ate. And so a younger generation prefers chicken, it seems, as a whole. So that's a positive pressure. Some of the other side of it, if you look at the chicken market and how the industry has responded to what the market has asked them to do. One of the things y'all probably heard of antibiotic-free chickens, or no antibiotic ever, or raised without antibiotics. I don't know what the next acronym is going to be or what it means, because there are always new ones. But that has taken over the industry. Right now, there is no what we'd call traditional full antibiotic programs being run in the industry. All the chicken have some form of what I call antibiotic attenuated production. They're either, well, right now, 52% is no antibiotic ever, which means no antibiotics ever. 26% they use what they call reduced usage of non-medically important antibiotics. So that means like bacitracin or some things like that we don't use in the medical industry. And then 22% or so have moved what we call ionophores only, which is using coccidiostats. That was a problem for a while, because a lot of these market companies that wanted no antibiotics ever, they would classify coccidiostat as an antibiotic. So, but what happens when you try to grow chickens that are fighting coccidia? It's a bad situation. So we had to make some changes. Some of those companies started pushing back some of those market pressures and some of those customers and said, we've got to use coccidiostats to grow healthy chickens. So now, and I foresee going forward, that section will probably grow as a percentage of the industry. The no antibiotic ever, antibiotic free was pushing 60% about 2 years ago. At the time, I expected that to continue to go up, but because of the problems and the issues trying to grow chickens that way, that has contracted and been replaced by the ionophores only to a great degree. Problem is, can we continue to get the same production at the same cost with these improved or new methods? And the industry is struggling with that. Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. GAP production. Here's what a GAP production is. GAP stands for Global Animal Partnership. Basically, that's a bunch of people who don't know anything about growing chickens telling you how to grow chickens. That's what it means. And but it's market pressures that tend to push integrators into how they grow their birds. Proposition 12, if you've heard about that, mainly in California, you say we're not going to buy any eggs from any company that produces eggs in birthing cages. Well, that's up to in the Supreme Court right now, so who knows where that'll go. But all of that pushes backdoor pressure on the industry. This idea of sustainability. Who knows what sustainability is? Because my definition and yours is probably different. But that a lot of companies making these sustainability promises. We're going to be net zero in 2050 or 2030. And we keep seeing those dates get pushed back. But that puts a pressure on the market and puts pressure on the integrators, and that rolls downhill. And then the big one that's in red, that's really on everybody's mind in the industry, is high path avian influenza. It did not go away this year, and it's still hanging around, and now it's on the rise again. It's almost to the point that I wouldn't say this, but it's almost endemic. It's going to be around, I think. We got to learn how to address it and how to approach it and how to live with it to some extent. I don't know if that'll be in vaccines. Who knows what that'll mean, but it's going to be a constant pressure going forward, I'm afraid. Right now, we're approaching 60 million birds. That number will change tomorrow, unfortunately. So that's a pressure. I wouldn't be a good economist if it didn't have some graphs for you to look at. So if we look at the broader prices that we've seen over the last year, I call it a price tsunami, or a price wave. As we came out of the pandemic, life got back to normal. Folks started buying food, buying chicken, pushed the broiler prices to unprecedented highs. You see that hump right there. Well, what happens when the prices are really good? Poultry integrators are very good to get production up. We started growing chicken, putting more chickens out, more chickens out. Poultry companies made a lot of money. They made a lot of money. And then got chickens back on the shelves. Folks could buy chicken again. Start seeing that price pressure come back down. But it's staying up. If you look at the 2023 numbers, that number is somewhere around that 120-ish. It's still higher than the overall multi-year average. Overall demand for chicken, though, is still good. It's still good demand. So that's going to keep those prices up, I think. And that's going to continue to push integrators to get more birds out. Something that the poultry industry has always been good at is we can very quickly get more birds in the field. So how long is that price going to stay up there? But there are some things that are contracting that expansion. Now, I'll talk about that in a minute. I always like to talk about chicken wings. It's a really interesting topic for a lot of people. Last year, about this time, I was talking about if you could find some chicken wings for the Super Bowl, you're going to pay 3 prices for them. Now, you walk in the door, they might hand you some as a prize just for coming in the door. They are extremely cheap. We've got a backlog of chicken wings. You can't hardly give them away. But then I went to a chicken ring restaurant Wednesday night, and their prices hadn't gone down a single bit. Didn't make sense to me. But the wholesale prices are extremely low because during that, when the chicken prices in general were so high, we were producing a lot of birds. If y'all remember, chicken wing prices were really high. So folks kind of got their fill of expensive chicken wings. Whenever chicken comes with 2 wings. So as we're producing more chicken, now we got a backlog of wings. And so that's pushing that price to, as you can see, historically low numbers. So have a big party this Super Bowl and buy plenty of wings. If you look at the long-term problems that could be facing the industry and start looking at some of these numbers, I'm no industry guy, so I kind of know what was going on here. If you look at our hens and roosters, our breeder numbers, which is what produces the eggs and the chicks that turn into broilers. If you look at the last 2 years, we have put a whole lot of breeder hens out in the field. Put a lot more hens out in the field because you got to have more hens if you're going to produce more chickens. Put a lot of hens out in the field, but if you look at their production, our chicks per layer has been lower the last 2 years than historical averages. Matter of fact, talking to some breeder growers I know, they've seen their numbers go from 150, 160 eggs per hen down to 120 or so eggs per hen. Their production has gone down. That is some genetic issues, some other issues going on that could be affecting this, but that is a problem going forward because if you're getting fewer chicks per hen, you got to put out a whole lot more hens to get the same number of broilers. You need more hens, you got to have more housing. Housing is extremely expensive right now. So that's a problem within the industry. How can we even maintain this production in the long run? And then again, if you look at the broiler chicks place, we're putting a lot of hens out. We're getting some additional broiler chicks in total because of that. So we're placing a lot more broiler chicks than historically been the case. But you look at that variance between the blue line and the red line on the graph on the left and the blue line and the red line on the graph on the right, our broiler slaughter is not as big an increase as our broiler chicks place. So that's telling me we got a mortality issue. We're losing some of these birds in the field before they get to the plant. Where does that go back? Go back to the previous slide where we talked about the no antibiotics ever and all these different new ways growing chickens we're having to grow. It's just not as successful. We lose more birds. Our mortality has gone up in the field. So that has an effect when it gets back to the market. what we see, and this is a conservative number, 1,500, probably more broiler houses currently needed in the US to fulfill anticipated demand. But that's a problem because those houses are costing $18 to $22 a square foot. That's with no land cost. That's just the house. That number 10 years ago was around $10 to $12. So it costs a lot more money. Now, they'll say it is, well, who has to pay for that? Directly, it's the growers. Ultimately, it's the integrator because he's paying the grower. So all this is a production cost increase. I talked to one integrator, a live production VP, who was just going to his annual production company meeting. He says he hasn't changed his slide in the last 5 years that says they need 500 houses. They've needed 500 houses every year for the last 5 years just to keep up with where they need to go to overcome housing loss and to just hit the demand that they're shooting for. Housing is a really big problem. What they're having to do is put a lot of money into grower incentives to get that housing built. Is that sustainable? I'm talking about a lot of money. On the breeder side, there's some integrators that are basically paying for the breeder house in cash. So the grower has no cash outlay because they got to have those houses. Is that sustainable long term? It's a question. I'm not sure it is. For the grower, some of these cash incentives could potentially present a serious tax liability. If integrators is going to give you $350,000 cash year one on top of what you're going to make growing your birds, you're going to get taxed on that money the first year. So there's some tax planning that the growers need to really think about in some of these situations. There's been some pay increases. Is it enough? Probably not. But what we've seen is a change in the basic business model of the broiler industry. See a lot of what I call investment housing going on now. That's where you have an investment group that goes in and builds 150 houses across a complex. And they own those houses, they hire management. So it's kind of moving away from the traditional family farm model that we've seen in the broiler industry. How far is that going to go? I can tell you from my conversations, most of the integrators don't like it, but they're getting used to it and learning how to operate in that model. So it may be more and more of a futuristic thing to go into this idea where we have these investment housing.
Where are you seeing that kind of stuff happen? Like
most time we see it happening where a complex or a company is building a new complex or a complex going through a major expansion and they need housing now and they can't find enough individual farmers that's got the cash, that's got the ability to get the money, has the land to build the houses. If they need 250 houses to finish an expansion in a plant, they can't wait for 2 years to get that. So that's where I see it happening a lot.
certain areas of the country that's more popular?
It's not hit in the southeast quite as much yet, but there is some complexes. I know in Tennessee it's happened. I've seen it happen in Nebraska at the new at the Costco complex. It's happened some in Arkansas. I mean, it's happening here and there, just where there's an extreme need for housing. Won't spend a lot of time talking about this, but y'all know, you may have heard there is some pressure from the governmental side on changing how poultry growers are paid, particularly broiler growers are paid. And a lot of this was pushed forward with the recent Wayne-Sanderson merger. Department of Justice basically told them and the Federal Trade Commission, in order to make this merger happen, y'all gonna have to change how you pay broiler growers, basically. They forced them to come up with something more of a standardized pay system that's not a competition-based pay system. And so I see that changing eventually, probably nationwide, how broiler growers are paid versus being paid on a traditional tournament style system to more of a base pay plus incentive system. And how it's going to change is because Wayne Sanderson was forced to do this, but they have complexes that intermingle in with other companies where there's competition before growers. So there may be some competition between company B and a Wayne Sanderson, a grower to switch. Well, it won't take long until these other companies have to make some changes in order to compete for growers. So this may be an up and coming thing. It was already happening in the market, or the market was kind of forcing this to happen because integrators were needing growers so badly. But this has pushed it a little bit harder. Where it's going to go, growers have to be careful. Growers have to be careful about this. Just because a company says we're going to pay you a consistent base pay may or may not be the best thing for you. Some of the tournament pay, but because that base pay system is not going to be as high as top pay in the tournament is going to be. So, where are you going to be in that mixture? Growers need to really think about that. There's some talk about going to a square foot pay. For a broiler grower, in my opinion, that's probably not the best option. Because if I'm going to be paid on per square foot, that means I get no incentive for my increased production or time or effort. Two things there. If I'm an integrator, that means I'm probably not going to get the best effort from my growers. If I'm a grower, then my potential has a definite ceiling to it. So that may or may not be the best thing. I do see some combination of square foot plus incentive that might work pretty good. We just have to see where it goes. Table eggs. I know Georgia has some table eggs. We don't have any speak of in Alabama. But the interesting thing is I see table eggs as an experiment of what the whole industry is facing. Can we raise chickens out in the yard and feed the country? You might believe that? Good. Because we can. But where is this going to go nationwide? I don't have a problem if you got a market and you can fill it and make a profit, more power to you. That's great. We have to be careful though, is getting the information out to the country and the consumer is we can't feed the world chickens in the pasture. We can't feed them with eggs or with chicken. And we have to get that message out properly so that people understand. The other problem is how much protection do these birds, this pasture here, have from avian influenza? Zero. So that's a problem. And that question is starting to be asked now. Just a little bit on commercial table eggs. How will the cage layer system respond? And how will the cage-free systems respond to high path avian influenza? There's kind of two conversations going on. We got folks up here talking about cages and not cages. We got folks over here talking about my birds are dying like crazy from high path influenza. These folks got to start talking to each other because this could be a problem. And I don't know that we can say we're being fair with the chicken's welfare and his ability to be happy by turning him out in the pasture where he's going to catch avian influenza and we're going to have to kill him. These two things need to be discussed together. Interest rates. Costs a lot of money to build a broiler farm. It costs a lot of money to build a cage layer table egg farm. So as these interest rates go up, that pressure on getting new housing to fulfill the demand is going to be higher and higher. I'm getting close to the end. I'm going to wrap up here so we can have some quick discussion. Real quick, poultry growers always want to know what's gas prices going to do. Natural gas long-term forecast is to be a little bit lower in the next 2 years. That's a good thing. Propane generally follows crude oil. So if you look at our propane inventories are high right now compared to the last couple of years. So future for propane probably looks a little better than I expected it to be. Electricity. What's the orange line? Electricity in general is going up. It's going to continue to go up. That's a real concern for broiler growers that spend a lot of money on electricity. Real quick, just a plug, because we do need a lot of new growers. A lot of people need some information on what it's like to grow chickens. I've got a five-part series on our ACES website. You can look at it right here, or whatever you need to do with that little QR code, you can find that. But this 5-part series talks about what it is to build a broiler farm, buy a broiler farm, get into the business, get in pullets, breeders, those kind of things. So it's basic information that we need to get out to people that are thinking about getting into the business. So I'll pause there, and if anybody's got any questions, we'll wrap it up.
What's the main driver behind egg prices that we're seeing now?
Main driver behind that, I don't know that there's one main driver. I think you got the extreme loss of laying hens from high path avian influenza. Got the input prices of feed that the companies have been looking at for the last several years. You got a demand glut hit. Folks are eating eggs, eating a lot of eggs. All those things kind of come together as why we're paying more money. And I think it's a blip. It's already come back down. And it's going to get back down where it was prior. I don't know the answer to that. Commercial eggs is not my primary focus. So I haven't spent a lot of time looking at it. Just from the outside looking in, that's what I see.
Is there any truth to there being a particular bird last year that had hatchability problems that might have led to lower placement and eventually lower broiler?
I didn't have the quote on this sheet, but there was a quote from the VP of Tyson that they made a mistake in purchasing a rooster into their breeder operation that really hit their fertility and their hatchability. Now, the other side of that is Tyson owns the breeder company that they bought it from, but whatever. Yes, there is one component of that is tied to a definite genetic situation.
Have they made strides? Were we in a better position than we were last year?
They have made some changes. Yes, they have made some changes, and I think, but if you talk to the growers out in the field, that change hasn't made it to the field yet. Any other questions? I think that's our time. I appreciate it. Thank you.